It always feels good to honor people here at UBC. I think we do a good job of that. I think we recognize the gifts in each individual. And whether it's with the retirement of Carrie Cheeseman, or with singing a song by Frank Asher, or lifting up even litanies by Garth House, who is a part of this UBC has a character and identity that I believe it celebrates and does a really good job of recognizing the gifts of each individual. So what you leave here, I do believe, is part of a legacy. It will be remembered. It won't just be remembered, but it will be recalled, whether it's in song and word and spirit and memory and scripture and a photo. You are loved, and you are loved here. So let us turn to something a little different. It's to 1 Peter. It's kind of an awkward scripture, but I do want to unpack it a bit and explore it together, and perhaps trust that God has something in it for us today. 1 Peter 2:19 that Leslie read, I'll just repeat. For it is a credit to you if being aware of God you endure pain while suffering unjustly. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you too should follow in his footsteps. Now, most scholars consider this to be a letter written by the disciple of Peter, not Peter himself, most likely written around the time of 90 of the Common Era, so some 60 years following the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. The letter addresses a critical situation at the time, which was how to deal with persecution. The Roman state was more than intolerant. In fact, they had wed religion with state authority in a way that was to follow one was to follow the other, and so to reject one, that is Rome's polytheism, was to reject the other. Now, as Baptists who believe in the separation of church and state, this is part of the reason why. Just as a side, state power wed with religious authority always seems to diminish not the state, but the faith. Now, within its context, the message of 1 Peter, written well after the resurrection, was one of encouragement. Endure the suffering as Christ endured his suffering. This canonical connection of suffering with Christ, that is, human suffering through persecution akin to that of Christ, however, over time, centuries of time, led Christians to find various forms of suffering, castigation, or self-denial in some way to participate with the sufferings of Christ. Which leads me to the question that I'd like us to consider today. Are Christians called to endure suffering? Now, in the 5th century, just to give you an idea of some of this ascetic tradition that runs through our Christian heritage. In the 5th century, a man by the name of Simon Stylites is known for his Christian devotion expressed through discipline and self-denial. In fact, he was so stern in his practice of self-denial that even the Desert Fathers, known for their self-denial, in fact said he had taken it too far, and they kicked him out of the monastery. Among his various forms of self-denial were isolation and starvation, but what he's most known for is in fact standing atop of pillars, standing some 10 to 15 feet tall on a platform no larger than 3 meters by 3 meters wide for years and years. How many years, you might ask? 34 years. 34 years. 34 winters, 34 summers, 34 springs atop. Now, it's said that the skeleton of a man named Simon was actually fed by children who would bring him goat's milk and bread up on this pillar. He was devout in his conviction. He prayed unceasing and believed firmly that the way of suffering connected him to Christ's suffering. I have no doubt that in his time, this was an expression of a life devoted to Christ. Is it for our time? Another Christian Theologian St. Ephraim, around the same time, counseled the monks that meditation on guilt, sin, death, and punishment, or the pre-enactment of the moment of the final judgment, was to be practiced and carried out with such intensity, and I quote, that the inner life becomes a burning lava that produces an upheaval of the soul and torment of the heart. We must get whatever is in us out. Now, this tradition extended into the priesthood as well, even later into the centuries, into the Middle Ages, where priests would wear undergarments woven with vines of thorns to undergo suffering as they oversaw the Mass and the host, recalling themselves in that moment the sufferings of Christ. If Jesus suffered, so must I suffer. Now, while asceticism as a practice diminished after the Protestant Reformation, its strands continue today in our scripture from 1 Peter. You endure just as Christ endured. One need not look very far to find many of Paul's different writings venerating, in some sense, suffering, often in his duality of mind and body, or body and soul, saying, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that my soul may flourish. Now, we can also see it in the Protestant denomination through what's known as the Protestant ethic for work, labor. The strands of asceticism, in fact, run through this. In that pursuit, in other words, put your nose to the grindstone, don't ask questions, take the wages that they give you and receive them gladly. Do your job, endure just as Christ endured for you. Yet when do we say enough is enough? When do we say enough to a toxic relationship, an abusive partner, a toxic work environment, a spouse that demeans us, wages that cannot feed us, or a landlord who denies us a place to live, a clean place to live? At what point do Christians shift from the mindset of, it's okay, I can endure all things quietly, to I can't take this anymore and refuse to? In October of 2002, fairly recently, a survey regarding toxic work environments was conducted with over 1,000 different respondents from across the United States. The average respondent was age 38, which included male, female, non-binary, and transgender respondents. Now, among those surveyed, guess what percentage? I actually was surprised this wasn't a little higher. Percentage indicated that they had experienced work at a toxic work environment. 69%. So almost 3/4, 3 out of 4. 20%, that is 200 respondents, indicated that they were presently or currently at that time working in a toxic work environment. So what constitutes toxic work environments? What constitutes, at that time, toxic anything? But specifically for work environments, gossip, cliques, favoritism, forced overtime or unpaid overtime, a narcissistic director who makes everything about them, a lack of transparency in the workplace where employees don't know what's really happening, a lack of feedback or willingness of management to listen or really listen, and too much focus on company output, right, rather than employee well-being. Curiously, among the respondents, I just think this is worth noting, among those even who did not express working currently or having worked in a toxic work environment, all indicated a general mistrust of management, a disconnect between the employees and leadership. So what effects does a toxic work environment, for instance, have on your well-being? Studies indicate that insomnia happens, people's diet changes, a general feeling of dread as you wake up, in the morning, a change in appetite, forgetfulness, and physical pain are all symptoms of that ongoing chronic toxicity that sometimes you just get comfortable with. So, as faithful people following Christ, when do we move from endurance to active resistance? Does the faith that venerates Jesus' suffering also declare that God's desire is not for victimization or suffering, but rather for calm water, green pastures, clean water, tables where cups overflow, and where there is no want? What about inside the church? When do we defend the space rather than make space for a toxic person? I had the privilege of attending the bread meeting with several members of this church. You can actually see the little photo of us, which is really sweet. During our meeting, the organization of Bread, which I understood was the largest gathering of faithful people gathering for the purposes of social justice in the United States. Now, that is hard for me to believe, but they said it. It's fake news, but it was news. So at this organization, at this meeting, we asked for police training that's calling for active bystander training for all police force, that instills in each one of our police members a responsibility that even if they're not the primary arresting officer, that they too are responsible for the situation at hand. They also requested, and we requested, restorative practices in our schools that shift the emphasis from suspension for bad behavior to how do we restore and heal whatever is causing the bad behavior. And in all of these requests, I just named a few, the resonant message was not that of endure suffering. We're sorry about your housing situation. We're sorry about the epidemic of dropouts in students. It wasn't to be endured, but to be changed. Our plight was not to endure, but to improve. Mark Heim is an American Baptist professor and theologian, and he authored a lovely book called Saved from Sacrifice, A Theology of the Cross. Now, in his book, and I'll just read a small section of it because it's really heavy. And sometimes you get into these things and you almost have to clear your desk and clear everything, get coffee, and really, really dig in. But he writes this. He said, the averted sacrifice of Isaac goes also with the reversed sacrifice of Jesus. The story of Joseph, who of course was enslaved by his brothers, but yet becomes a prince. The prophet's condemnation of scapegoating the widow, the weak, or the foreigner. The story of Job, the Psalm's obsession with the innocent victim of collective violence, all go hand in hand with the transparent account of Jesus' death in the Gospels, with the biblical interpretation of a new community that grew up in solidarity around a risen, crucified victim. Jesus is the victim who will not stay sacrificed, whose memory is not erased, and who forces us to confront this reality. In other words, Jesus becomes the victim that we see God in all victims, and that we see victimization and suffering as anything but God's design. These things in the cross, which now stands empty, God has thwarted. Now, I don't think it's an accident that the lectionary pairs these texts together. Readings from 1 Peter 2 about suffering and its endurance, and even our call to it, with Psalm 23 and the images of green pasture and environments of plenty, along with the Gospel of John, which we did not read, where Jesus says, I've come that they might have life and have it abundantly. To me, the contrast in these lectionary pairings is intentional, and it's worth exploring and at least probing some of those questions and asking them ourselves. Have we settled into something that's toxic and made excuses for it even called ourselves into it? Have we settled for a job that demeans or a partner that disrespects and called it somehow God's way? Or on the flip side of this, have we demanded so much that we'd find a way to complain about anything? Green pastures, streams of water, and tables of plenty. What we know of human experience is that every day is not an abundant day, no matter what Joel Osteen says. Every day is not green pastures or calm waters. There are diagnoses, divorces, struggles that we all go through. Some days are a grind, and sometimes there are valleys of the shadow of death that we walk through. There are disagreements and fair fights, even in the best of relationships. Yet, do we remain in these seasons? Do we get comfortable with these seasons or workplaces, or too often in toxic environments where we've stayed far too long? When have we stayed too long? And when have we taken less than what we should? So does following Christ mean enduring suffering? In my opinion, no. But we will, and we all will, endure suffering. We will walk through times of difficulties, and we will walk through valleys where there is no light. Yet there is one who walks ahead of us and with us. We are truly saved by Christ's wounds. And when we encounter suffering and victimization around us, we must be careful not to venerate it, but to see it as something ultimately that God defeats, not designs. And for those who sit by the streams of water with cups overflowing and never remember to cherish the breeze or speak a word of gratitude or invite someone to join you, let us see abundance rather than everything that's wrong. And finally, for those of you who may have remained too long tolerating toxicity, this is not for you to endure. This is for Christ to defeat. And let me remind you, you have a community of solidarity around you who walks and goes with you. A community of solidarity gathered around the victim Christ, who is yet and always living and active. Amen. Would you join with me in just a time of silence as we reflect on God's Spirit and all that that Spirit says?